Somewhere in a director's private journal sits a furious rant aimed at one of the biggest singers in rock history, written days before his first studio movie was finished. That movie arrived looking like a breezy ode to teenage summer, and most of the country shrugged. Then something strange happened over the years that followed. A sun-warmed portrait of one ordinary night in 1976, made on pocket change by a cast of total unknowns, slowly turned into one of the most beloved coming-of-age films ever made. Tucked inside it are half a dozen future superstars, a famous line invented seconds before the camera rolled, and three men who would one day take the director to court. It all begins with where the movie got its name. 1. The title was borrowed from Led Zeppelin. The phrase comes from a 1969 rock song about confusion and restless youth, and Richard Linklater pulled it for a reason most viewers never catch. To him, it captured something true and slightly sad about being a teenager, the idea that you only really understand those years once a full decade has passed and you can finally look back on them with clear eyes. He set his story in the spring of 1976 and put it in front of audiences 17 years later, in 1993. The distance between the memory and the telling was baked into the project from the very start, a quiet bit of design hiding in plain sight inside the name itself. The band behind that song was Led Zeppelin, and Linklater wanted their music in the picture badly. The irony is hard to miss. For all that borrowing, not a single Zeppelin track ever made it into the finished movie. The name stuck while the song stayed firmly out. Getting their actual music cleared turned into one of the longest, most painful fights of the whole production. A battle over the soundtrack that would drag on right up to the final days of editing. When it finally broke, it broke the director's heart. 2. An indie that jumped the studio line. Most first-time filmmakers wait years for a studio to take a real chance on them. Linklater waited about a month. His scrappy debut, Slacker, played the 1991 Sundance Film Festival and caught the eye of a Universal producer named Jim Jacks, who came away impressed enough to fly the young Texan out to Los Angeles for a meeting. What Jacks did next was unusual. He handed Linklater a check for $25,000 just to go away and write a script. No strings and no guarantees. Linklater used most of that money to clear the debts he had run up making Slacker in the first place, which tells you how thin the margins of his world still were. He turned in a first draft in roughly 4 weeks, and Universal liked what it read so much that it pushed the project ahead of around 30 other films already sitting in development. For an unproven director carrying a cast of total nobodies, that kind of studio confidence was almost unheard of. The whole thing was eventually made for about $6.9 million, a modest sum even by the standards of the day, which makes the early faith stand out all the more. An Austin indie kid had walked straight past the usual queue and into the studio system, at least for the moment. 3. A whole town built from real classmates. Huntsville, a quiet patch of East Texas, is where Linklater spent his teenage years in the mid-1970s, and that stretch of his life became the raw material for the entire picture. The setting on screen is never given a name, and the shoot itself happened up the road in Austin, but the bones of the place are pure Huntsville, scrubbed of a label so it could stand in for almost anywhere. He went a good deal further than mood. Many of the characters carry the actual names and personalities of kids he grew up with. Slater, Floyd, Wooderson, and Pickford among them, lifted more or less intact from his own memory. One thing he did change was the famous gathering spot. In real life, the big party happened at a fire tower, but he swapped it for a moon tower, since those tall cast-iron lights are a genuine Austin landmark you can still find scattered around the city today. Borrowing friends' names straight onto the screen felt completely harmless at the time. It was affectionate, even fond, a private little nod to the people who had shaped his youth. Years down the line, though, a few of those real men would come to see the whole thing very differently, and that one casual decision would eventually follow Linklater all the way into a courtroom. 4. McConaughey was discovered in a hotel bar. The Austin Hyatt was winding down one night in the early 1990s when a young film student struck up a conversation that would rewrite his entire life. His name was Matthew McConaughey, and he had wandered in with no plans beyond a few drinks. The bartender leaned over and pointed out another regular sitting nearby, a casting director named Don Phillips, who happened to be working on a local movie. The two of them got to talking, mostly about golf, of all things, and they kept at it for nearly 3 hours straight, until the staff finally turned them out at last call. By the end of the night, Phillips had invited the student to come read for a small part, a smooth, older fellow called Wooderson, who was being cast out of the local talent pool. Linklater had his doubts at first. The The role was meant to read as a little off-putting, and McConaughey, with his easy good looks, struck him as far too handsome to pull it off. The audition changed his mind in a hurry. On paper, the character was tiny, a few days of work at the very most, but McConaughey was so good in front of the camera that the part kept growing as the shoot went on. What began as a throwaway bit in a low-key ensemble soon turned into the spark of one of the biggest movie star careers of his generation. 5. It almost took place inside one car. Before the final version existed, Linklater carried around a far stranger idea for what this story could be. His first concept barely moved at all. The entire film would unfold inside a single moving vehicle, running the exact length of a ZZ Top record, with each track on the album playing in the background as the characters simply drove and talked the whole way through. Cinematographer Lee Daniel later described the plan in almost comically simple terms. Essentially 2 shots in total, one of a guy loading an 8-track tape into the deck, the other of 2 friends driving around and chatting. Stripped down like that, there was no party scene and none of the crowded, clique-filled town that fills the finished film. The whole thing would have been motion, music, and conversation, with very little else around it to break the spell. Linklater scrapped the idea because he wanted room to follow many different characters and, as he put it, represent a whole range of points of view, rather than just one. The looser, wandering structure won out, and the movie grew into a sprawling ensemble. Still, it is striking how close the picture came to being a tight little experiment instead. What would that stripped-back version have turned into if he had ever shot it? 6. Woodison was his own older brother. The actor cast as Woodison, the grown-up who keeps circling back to the high school long after his own graduation, was in real life younger than several of the kids playing the students around him. McConaughey was younger than Sasha Jensen, Joey Lauren Adams, and Parker Posey, all 3 of them cast as teenagers he shares scenes with. The character itself came from very close to home. McConaughey modeled a good deal of him on his own older brother, Pat, the familiar type who finishes school but never quite drifts away from the old crowd. That lived-in familiarity let him play someone who had clearly aged out of the scene without ever fully leaving it behind. The character's easygoing motto, "Just keep livin'," stuck with the actor for the rest of his life, and he later named his production company JKL in its honor. The result felt observed rather than invented. A younger man borrowing his brother's whole manner to play an older one gave the part a sly, knowing humor that you cannot really write from scratch. There is a neat little twist buried in all of it too. The lingering guy who could not move on turned out to be the very role that moved McConaughey forward into stardom. 7. Vince Vaughn lost the role to his twin. Early on, Vince Vaughn read for the part of Benny, and on paper, he looked like a perfectly solid fit for it. Linklater ended up passing for an unusual reason that had nothing to do with talent. Vaughn looked so much like Ben Affleck, who was already locked in as the swaggering bully Fred O'Banion, that the director worried audiences would mix up the 2 unknown faces and lose track of which one was which. At the time, of course, neither young man meant anything to anybody, so 2 tall, dark-haired newcomers with similar builds could easily blur together for a crowd meeting them both cold. So the role of Benny went to Cole Hauser instead, and Vaughn walked away from the project empty-handed. The funny part only became clear with time. Both men went on to long, separate, instantly recognizable careers. Vaughn as a comedy headliner, and Affleck as an Oscar winner and bona fide leading man. The very thing Linklater feared back then, 2 interchangeable faces nobody could tell apart, would be flat-out unthinkable today. Put their pictures side by side now, and anyone could pick them out of a crowd in a heartbeat. 8. All right. Improvised. The camera was rolling on McConaughey's very first scene in any movie, and the first words he would ever speak on film were never written down anywhere. He had spent real time beforehand thinking hard about who this guy was. By his own account, he decided Woodison cared about 4 things in life, and 4 things only: his car, rock and roll, having a good time, and the company of pretty girls. That was the whole man, boiled right down to the essentials. He was not walking in blind. Then, he had a working compass for the character before the cameras ever turned over. As the take began, something quietly clicked into place. He was sitting in his car. The radio was playing. He felt good, and he was driving over to talk to a girl. 3 of his 4 boxes were already ticked before he had said a single word, and the 4th was the entire reason he was rolling down the street in the first place. Loose and fully in character, he let a few easy syllables slip out, a little cadence he had lifted from a Live Doors album, where he had heard Jim Morrison drawl the same word out to the crowd between songs. What landed on the tape was, "All right, all right, all right." The words came out loose and easy, pure instinct caught on film. In the moment, it honestly felt like nothing at all, a tiny ad-lib in a tiny part. The real power surfaced much later, in the editing room, where that slow, satisfied delivery suddenly played like the whole character distilled down into 3 lazy beats. Nobody on set that day could have guessed how far those words would eventually travel. Those few syllables became the seed of a career that would go on to carry an Academy Award. Decades later, McConaughey still opens speeches with the line, and crowds still say the words right back to him before he can even finish them. 9. Renee Zellweger is hiding in the film. Somewhere in the background of a few crowd shots, easy to walk right past without a second glance, stands a young woman who had not yet become a household name. That woman was Renee Zellweger, captured here years before her Oscar-winning run, tucked into the movie in an uncredited extra role that most viewers never even register. She was on the radar for something a good deal bigger at one point. Casting had eyed her for Darla, the showy, sharp-tongued queen bee of the senior girls, before that part ultimately went to Parker Posey instead. The near miss makes her blink and you miss it cameo all the more fun to know about. A future leading lady hiding among the extras, while a different newcomer grabbed the showy role. For eagle-eyed fans who like to pause the movie and hunt for tomorrow's stars buried in plain sight, Zellweger is a quiet little reward sitting right there in the cast all along, there waiting to be spotted. As for exactly why Posey edged her out for the flashier, meaner role, Linklater later kept his explanation refreshingly blunt and simple, telling interviewers only that Parker was just crazier. 10. The 15-year-old with grad student habits. The big find was how Richard Linklater summed him up, singling out the standout discovery of the whole Austin casting search. The kid in question was Wiley Wiggins, who landed the role of the wide-eyed freshman Mitch, and what made him such a catch had almost nothing to do with looking the part of a nervous 14-year-old. Co-producer Anne Walker-McBay reportedly lit up the very moment she spotted him, won over by his name and his mop of shaggy hair, before he had read so much as a single line of dialogue. Wiggins also happened to fit a much larger pattern on this production. Most of the supporting players, and a good slice of the main ensemble too, were pulled straight out of Texas, many of them tracked down through cards handed out to actual high schoolers around the city. That stubborn commitment to real, undiscovered faces is a big part of why the group up on screen feels like a genuine crowd of teenagers, rather than a polished roster of working professionals. Wiggins happened to be the brightest of the bunch. Linklater summed up the whole appeal in a phrase that has stuck ever since, describing a 15-year-old who somehow already carried, by his account, all the bad habits of a grad student. 11. Real Austin spots you can still visit. Pull up to a little drive-in burger joint called Top Notch on Burnett Road, and you are standing in the exact spot where Wooderson rolls in for his big entrance. The town in the movie is completely invented, but the real places the cameras pointed at are entirely findable, and fans still track them down decades later. The Emporium Pool Hall is where the teenagers kill time and circle each other between scenes. The big climactic blowout was staged at a genuine moonlight tower, one of those tall historic light structures that still dot the Austin skyline to this day. Even the spot used for the rowdy initiation of the incoming freshman girls has a quiet second act of its own. That building later traded its movie past for something far more wholesome. It reopened, of all things, as a neighborhood public library, swapping screen mischief for reading rooms. Taken all together, these locations add up to a kind of unofficial walking tour you can actually go and take in person. A real-world map laid carefully over a fictional one. The made-up town at the heart of the film turns out to have a very real, very findable address. 12. The cast lived in 1976 before filming. We were supposed to morph completely into that time, Jason London later recalled, describing the unusual marching orders the young actors were given well before a single frame was ever shot. Linklater wanted total, no half-measures immersion. He told everyone to listen to nothing but era-appropriate music and to carry themselves, day to day, as though the decade had never ended. The whole effort went well beyond costumes and a period soundtrack. There was a genuine rehearsal and bonding stretch built right into the schedule, deliberately designed to turn a group of strangers into something that felt like an actual circle of lifelong friends. They hung out together constantly. They goofed around, and they let the period soak in until the set stopped feeling like a set at all. You can feel the payoff in nearly every loose, drifting scene of the finished film. The easy, unforced chemistry that makes the picture so endlessly rewatchable did not come from luck or from clever cutting in the edit. It grew straight out of those strange weeks of pretending the present did not exist, which is exactly why, all these years later, the friendships up on screen still read so convincingly as the real thing. 13. The actors designed their own paddles. Look closely at the wooden boards the seniors swing around, and one of them carries a small engraving that makes no sense at all for 1976. The marking 17 years. It is a private little joke that almost no one sitting in the audience would ever stop to decode. The performers who carried them around built and customized the things themselves, which fits neatly with the movie's hands-on, shoestring spirit. It was the sort of corner cutting that doubled as character, with the cast leaving their own fingerprints all over the props. The 17 years note is a sly wink at the 17-year gap between the year the story is set, 1976, and the year it reached theaters, 1993. The homemade touches did not stop with the boards either. The sleepy shop teacher dozing through the whole paddle-making scene was played by a real teacher pulled from the very school where they happened to be shooting. Small, half-hidden details like that are scattered all over the picture for anyone patient enough to go looking for them. The closer you watch, the more the rough seams of a tiny budget turn into the homemade charm of the thing. 14. A shooting range trip went off. The rails. A group of young actors, fresh off weeks of intense bonding, piled into cars one afternoon and headed out to a gun range for some target practice. On paper, it sounds harmless enough, the kind of thing a tight-knit cast might do to blow off a little steam. In practice, according to Rory Cochrane's recollection in the film's own oral history, it became one of the more genuinely alarming stories from the entire production. Cochrane, by his own admission, was not in a clear state of mind that day. He had taken something beforehand that left him pretty far from himself, and the others did not realize quite how impaired he was until things had already gotten loose. Loaded firearms were being waved around outside the lanes, handled in the careless way that only seems funny right up until the second it very much does not. The penny dropped for everyone at once the moment Cochrane fired a shot straight up through the roof. I will be honest, that one stops me cold every time. It is a small miracle the whole afternoon ended with just a hole in the ceiling and nothing worse on anyone's conscience. The story usually gets passed around as a wild scrap of cast folklore, and yes, there is a loose, freewheeling charm to how this crew lived when the cameras were off. But an impaired young man swinging a real, loaded gun around is the kind of memory that ought to come with a wince, not a grin. 15. It has no real plot, on purpose. Most movies live or die on a central hero chasing a clear goal against some steadily rising obstacle. This one has neither. There is no main character to root for, and no driving conflict to resolve. Just a loose, generous web of overlapping storylines following different cliques across one single day, at the very tail end of the school year. Some threads follow the incoming freshmen and some the seniors, while a few older hangers-on drift through who cannot quite leave any of it behind, and they all brush past each other without ever locking into a single plot. Linklater built it that way entirely on purpose, and the choice ran right down to the bone. He cared far more about mood, texture, and the moment-to-moment truth of how teenagers pass an aimless summer night than he ever did about a tidy three-act machine. Plot, to him, was almost a distraction from the real thing he wanted to capture. He was after the loose rhythm of actual life, where nothing in particular has to happen for an evening to matter, so the film simply drifts alongside its characters and lets them be exactly who they are. At the time, that openness threw some viewers, who sat there waiting for a story to kick into gear that never quite arrived. Over the years, though, the very same quality became the secret of the film's staying power. With no plot to burn through on a first viewing, there is always something fresh to catch on the 5th pass, or the 10th, a background joke, a minor character you never clocked, a throwaway line that suddenly lands. That is the strange gift of a movie with nowhere in particular to be. It rewards the kind of repeat viewing a tighter story would otherwise use up. The absence of a story turned out to be the whole entire point. So what is it, exactly, that keeps pulling people back again and again to a movie where, strictly speaking, almost nothing ever happens? 16. Tarantino calls it one of the greats. It's my favorite film of the 90s, Quentin Tarantino has said more than once, and he has never once been quiet about it. Coming from one of the most opinionated, encyclopedic directors alive, that is no small endorsement to throw around. He has slipped the title onto serious all-time best critics' ballots and name-checked it in interviews for years on end. For a movie that Hollywood essentially forgot during its first run in theaters, having a champion of his stature standing in your corner changes the whole conversation. Critics and historians had spent years quietly filing the film away, under minor and forgettable, right up until loud, insistent voices like his started telling everyone otherwise. That kind of steady, repeated praise from a deeply respected insider did real, measurable work over time. It helped lift the movie up out of the bargain bin of memory and into the canon of films that serious people actually take seriously. And ordinary audiences came around at their own gradual pace once that door had been pushed open. He has gone so far as to place this small, scruffy hangout movie on the very same shelf as Taxi Driver, which is about as high as film world praise can possibly reach. 17. A sixth of the budget went to songs. Roughly 30 tracks play across this movie, and that single count is the whole key to understanding how it works. For Linklater, the music was never background decoration laid politely over the action. It was the action, the actual air the characters breathed from scene to scene, and he treated the soundtrack as one of the most important things he had to get exactly right. Strip the songs out, and you would be left with a very different, much quieter film. Getting it right cost a small fortune by the standards of a production this size. He spent close to a full sixth of the entire budget on music licensing alone, and even that enormous slice somehow was not enough to cover it. The music costs blew past their assigned limit by about $200,000, a serious overrun on a film made for well under $10 million. Linklater paid the difference anyway, because the wall-to-wall sound was simply non-negotiable in his mind. You can hear that investment paying off from the very opening frames. Aerosmith's Sweet Emotion kicks the whole thing off as a car eases lazily into the school parking lot. A few beats later, Alice Cooper's School's Out detonates the giddy, anarchic relief of the final bell of the year. Deeper into the night, Bob Dylan storms in with Hurricane. Each carefully chosen needle drop does the work that a traditional score normally would, setting mood and place and era all at once without needing a single line of dialogue. For a whole generation, those songs are now permanently fused to these images, so that the opening riff alone can drop you straight back into that parking lot. The music was the movie's entire emotional weather, and Linklater understood, better than the accountants did, that a cheaper soundtrack would have left him with a noticeably lesser film. 18. He banned the Steadicam for realism. To make absolutely everything feel authentically of the 1970s, Linklater turned down a tool that most directors of the era were happily embracing: the smooth, gliding Steadicam. He deliberately wanted the rougher, handheld texture of older, grittier filmmaking, the slightly unsteady look that matched the very grain of the decade he was busy recreating. A glossy, floating camera would have given the whole game away, signaling a slickness that no real night in 1976 ever had. That one quiet choice runs underneath the entire picture like a current. It pairs with the period cars, the thrift store wardrobe, and the wall-to-wall music to build an immersion so complete that the seams between then and now seem to dissolve. Most people who sit down and watch the film never once consciously register the camera work at all. They feel, somewhere they cannot quite name, that it all looks right, worn in and a touch faded, the exact way a real memory of a real night tends to look in your head. It stands as the rare kind of technical decision you are meant to feel deeply without ever quite noticing it is there. 19. Robert Plant killed the Zeppelin dream. Two of the three surviving members of one of the biggest bands in rock history had already said a clear yes, which almost never happens for a small movie with no money to wave around. Linklater wanted their song Rock and Roll more than any other track he had been chasing for the soundtrack. Guitarist Jimmy Page came on board, reportedly swayed by a long, earnest, almost desperate begging video the director had sent his way. Bassist John Paul Jones agreed as well. With 2/3 of the band on his side, the dream felt close enough to touch. That left just one man still to convince. The lone holdout was Robert Plant, and Plant turned him down flat. The refusal landed just 2 days before the final mix was due to be locked, sinking long months of patient effort at the single cruelest possible moment imaginable. The very band that had loaned the movie its name, lifted off that 1969 record back at the start of all this, would not allow a single note of its catalogue into the finished cut. After all that begging and waiting, the director was left with the title and nothing else. Linklater was absolutely gutted, and he poured every bit of it into his private journal, page after page of raw fury aimed squarely at the singer who had killed the deal. The story does carry a sweeter epilogue, mind you. Roughly a decade later, Jack Black personally coaxed Page into clearing Immigrant Song for Linklater's School of Rock, so the director finally got his Zeppelin in the end, though not on this particular picture. There is a real symmetry to that. The same guitarist who could not save the first film happily turning up to bless a later one. As for how he felt in that bruised moment, though, his journal left absolutely no room for doubt. He wrote, plainly, that he would never forgive Robert Plant. 20. The studio sold it as a stoner movie. Gramercy Pictures took one long look at this gentle, bittersweet little memory piece and decided to sell it to the public as a rowdy party comedy. Full stop. The marketing leaned hard into the good time, let loose angle, all but promising audiences a wild and raucous night of teenage mischief. The trouble was that Linklater had never once meant the movie as a celebration of any of that. His version was something quieter and a little sad underneath, an observational look back at a single ordinary evening, far closer to a wistful memory than to a party invitation. He saw all the carousing on screen as texture, not as the actual point of the thing. The studio, on the other hand, saw it as the entire pitch. That widening gap between what he had made and how it got packaged left the film stranded between two different audiences, never quite reaching either one of them cleanly. The mismatch genuinely hurt. People who showed up expecting a loud, raucous romp came away let down by something so loose and meandering, while the very viewers who might have fallen for its melancholy were never even told it existed in the first place. The picture stumbled badly in theaters, in no small part because nobody on the studio side had ever pitched it as the thing it actually was. That single misfire quietly set the stage for one of the great second acts in modern movie history. 21. The Slacker crew brought its punk spirit. When Linklater moved up to a real studio film, he flatly refused to leave his old team behind. He brought back a whole host of crew members from Slacker, his scrappy first feature, including his trusted cinematographer Lee Daniel. A few of them were genuinely uneasy about signing on to anything that even faintly smelled like Hollywood. He insisted on it anyway. The way he saw the situation, the people who had helped him claw his way up from nothing had more than earned the trip up with him, and their rough, do-it-yourself instincts were exactly what he wanted to protect inside a bigger, slicker machine. He was set on making sure a little studio money would not sand the homemade edge off the kind of work that made his films feel so alive in the first place. That stubbornness shows up right there on the screen. The finished movie carries a loose, hand-built, faintly punk attitude that you almost never find in a studio production of its scale. By smuggling his independent crew straight into the system with him, Linklater managed to keep his handmade sensibility fully intact, even with a genuine budget behind him. The film ends up looking expensive in all the wrong, wonderful ways, which is to say, it does not look expensive at all. 22. It flopped before becoming a classic. By every single measure that mattered to a studio in the moment, the movie was a flat-out dud. It limped out of the gate with an opening weekend of only around $918,000, and from there, it crawled to roughly $8 million in total at the domestic box office. Set against a production budget of about $6.9 million, that counted as a clear and undeniable disappointment. Hollywood shrugged its shoulders and promptly moved on to the next thing. What nobody at the studio could see yet was the long tail quietly waiting out in living rooms all across the country. As home video and the booming rental market took off through the 90s, the film slowly found the wide audience it had never once reached in theaters, passed hand to hand on worn videotape until it became a real cult favorite. The turnaround kept building on itself for years afterward. It grew into one of the most rewatchable coming-of-age movies ever made, the kind of thing people return to again and again like an old friend. Entertainment Weekly eventually ranked it among the very best high school films of all time. The picture that theaters had completely written off had merely arrived a few years too early, and then waited around patiently for the rest of us to finally catch up to it. 23. Three men sued over their own names. In 2004, an unusual case landed in a New Mexico courtroom, brought by a handful of men who had grown up alongside the director and did not at all like what he had done with their identities. Years earlier, Linklater had lifted those names straight from his old Huntsville classmates, a decision that had felt purely affectionate at the time and slowly curdled into a very real grievance. The plaintiffs were Bobby Woodison, Andy Slater, and Richard Pink Floyd, the very people whose names hang on some of the movie's most memorable characters. Their specific complaints were detailed and pointed. Slater objected to a shop class scene, in which his on-screen namesake is shown putting together some illicit contraband, an image he felt smeared his good name. Woodison took the portrayal even harder than that, saying the smooth, lingering older character left him feeling, in his own words, kicked in the stomach. For men who had to keep right on living in a small Texas town under those exact names, seeing them publicly tied to that kind of material clearly stung in a way the filmmakers never intended. There were some real practical wrinkles to the case too. They filed specifically in New Mexico because its statute of limitations handed them a longer legal window in which to sue, and even with that advantage, the suit was ultimately thrown out of court. By their own frank admission, they had not acted any sooner because they had simply assumed a tiny, low-budget movie like this one would soon vanish and take the whole embarrassment along with it. Instead, of course, it grew into a beloved classic that absolutely refused to disappear. There lies the cruel little irony at the heart of the whole saga. By marching into court to pry themselves loose from the characters, the three men only ended up welding their own names to those roles forever. What started as an accidental, very nearly unmade flop ended up as one of the truest portraits of American adolescence ever committed to film, and a launching pad for a whole generation of stars who were nobodies when the cameras first rolled. Like the teenagers drifting through its single long night, the movie needed a few years before the rest of the world understood what it had. Hollywood gave up on Dazed and Confused right before everybody else fell in love with it, and that slow burn devotion is exactly why it still gets passed down to new viewers today. If this trip back to 1976 hit the spot for you, do the channel a favor and tap that like button, then subscribe so the next dig through movie history finds you. Before you go, settle one thing for me down in the comments. Which of these secrets caught you most off guard? And which line from this one do you still catch yourself quoting?